Hi everybody, my name is Michaela Schick and I am going to be presenting a professional development session for you all today on person-first language. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is person-first language. Additionally, I want to clarify that this presentation is specifically designed for middle school educators, but it's definitely applicable to anyone. So what is person-first language? Person-first language is a really simple way that we are going to change how we speak about people with disabilities. So the goal is to change how we speak about these people and also how we view them. And sometimes we also end up improving how they view themselves based on how the rest of the world sees them, views them, and speaks about and to them. So the goal here is to view people as individuals. So people are people first. So we have students who might have disabilities, but they are also students. They're also brothers, sisters, soccer players. They like Fortnite. They like baseball. They like basketball. Their favorite color is blue. They have all these interests and skills that are not represented by their disability. So we don't want to tie their entire identity to this disability is kind of the goal here. So it's really simple. All you're going to do is whenever you're discussing a person who has a disability, you're going to put the person and like a person word, so person, student, kid, something that describes a person first and the disability last. So I've included some examples here. This is really very simple, like I said. So instead of saying a disabled person, you just say a person with a disability. It's, again, really pretty simple. You're just putting the person first and then the disability after that. Instead of saying a blind person, you're going to say a person with a visual impairment. Instead of an autistic student, you would say a student with autism. I included in here a wheelchair kid. I don't think that's normally a language that maybe teachers would use, but maybe from our students we might hear something like that. And instead you're going to switch it to a kid using a wheelchair. So that also brings up a good point that you can also start working on this with your students and kind of teaching them person-first language too. And then I think this is the one that I know I have been the most guilty of throughout my career, and then I think that a lot of teachers are the most guilty of, is saying our SPED kids. So what are the scores like for our SPED kids? What are we going to do about inclusion efforts for our SPED kids? We hear that phrase a lot, and so instead of saying our SPED kids, we're going to say students receiving special education services, students enrolled in special education, or you could specifically say students with learning disabilities, students with intellectual disabilities, and kind of go by their different disabilities. So I'm kind of thinking that you might be asking this question of why does this matter? So a lot of people might ask that question. So why this matters is because people with disabilities are people first. Like I said, they have various interests, they have various skills and needs, and they are not their disability. So being autistic or having Down syndrome does not define a person, and we need to respect that people are individuals, people have their own characteristics and personalities, and this helps us view every person with a disability as an individual. So sometimes we get into this mindset of thinking, well, all autistic kids need this. And so when we're saying a kid with autism, we're saying, well, this is my student, Timothy, and you're talking about the person first, and that helps you realize that these people are individuals and they're not all the same. It also helps the people that we're speaking about see themselves as beyond their disabilities. So it can be kind of empowering for students with disabilities to start thinking of themselves as, well, what do I like? What am I? Kind of sort of situation. And we don't want them to just think they are their disability. This is especially true, I feel like, for middle school students, because students are forming so much of their identity in middle school that this is how we want them to see themselves, and we want it to be positive. And then finally, just it's really polite and respectful, and it's not about being politically correct. It's not about anything like that. It's just about we're seeing people with disabilities and disability advocacy groups saying that this is how people want to be referred to, so we're just trying to be respectful of the fact that people are saying this is how I would like to be referred to, and so I think the least we can do is just kind of respect those wishes. So words to avoid. So we're going to talk about some words that maybe we want to try to see if we can avoid. This kind of goes with person-first language, but it goes a little bit differently as well. So I think that pretty much every teacher at some point or another has been guilty of saying a student with special needs or our special needs students. And this kind of goes with detailing problems that students have. So if we talk about a student who's going to be in your class next year, and I tell you, well, this student can't walk, they don't have the fine motor skills to use pencils or pens, they are not able to verbally communicate, and they are not able to use the restroom on their own. I think your mind is going to start reeling about, oh my gosh, how am I going to teach this student? I don't know how I'm going to communicate with this student. And you're going to start thinking of the student as a problem. And we don't want to make our students sound like problems. And this also kind of goes into students hear the way that we speak about them, and it makes them view themselves as a problem, which is never something that we want for our students, especially, like I said, in middle school when they're trying to form these identities and they're going through so many different things. We don't want them to think of themselves as being a problem. So what are we going to say instead? So in the example I just gave you, I gave you a few things that a student could not do. So instead we're going to say what they need to be successful. So Joseph needs a wheelchair. So instead of saying he can't walk, he needs a wheelchair. Penelope needs help to use the restroom. Instead of saying she can't use the restroom by herself, we're going to say she needs help with that skill. Instead of saying that someone can't verbally communicate, we're going to say Deshawn needs to use text-to-speech devices to communicate. This kind of shows a teacher what they can do rather than just what the student can't do. The next word that we want to try to avoid is normal. So there's no one way to be normal. Everybody's different. Everybody has different abilities, interests, personalities, everything else. And people with disabilities are not abnormal. And there's a ton of people with disabilities. There's a ton of disabilities in the world. So this is not an abnormal group of people. So what should we say instead? We could just say students in general education. We could say people without disabilities. We could also just say students would be fine. So when we're trying to discuss our students who don't have disabilities, sometimes just saying students is fine. Sometimes saying students without disabilities would be okay too. So this one has gotten a lot of publicity in the last few years, and that's kind of from this like ban the R word campaign. You might have seen it on social media. You might have heard people talking about this. So the classification of mental retardation is not something that is currently being used. So when we have students in our class, we don't have any students who are classified as mentally retarded. So calling a student retarded does not communicate what the student can do, what their skills are, that they have individual interests and individual abilities. So we want to really avoid this word. You want to avoid classifying a student as this, and you also want to just avoid using it in your regular speech. I know that some people have grown up with the R word being used as a substitute for the word stupid, but even if you grew up with it, that doesn't mean that you can't change your language. For me, this is kind of like the way that we might speak about people of different races has evolved over time. The way that we are speaking about people with disabilities is likewise evolving over time. So what should we say instead? Say student with an intellectual disability instead of using the word retarded. We also want to really avoid talking about high and low functioning in students. So high and low functioning and other words that categorize ability really are not necessary, and I'm going to explain why. So one, they don't really give you any information that you want to convey. If I tell you this student is low functioning, that doesn't really tell you what the student can do or what they need. If I tell you something like they need assistance going to the restroom, that gave you a much better description of what the student needs than the words low functioning. It also kind of puts people into boxes and kind of puts a label on people that we don't necessarily want. So again, instead of saying high or low functioning, we just kind of want to describe the student's needs and what they can do. We also want to avoid words like suffers from or victim. So disabilities are not an illness, and we don't need to treat them like they are. So people do not suffer from autism. They are not victims of Down syndrome. These are disabilities that definitely require different care and different accommodations and modifications, but they are not something that we need to be treating like it's a deathly illness kind of deal. So it also kind of ingrains in us the fact that we should pity people with disabilities, which is absolutely not something that we want to do for our students. So people with disabilities are telling us that they do not want our pity. So let's not pity them, and let's just say a person with autism or a person with Down syndrome or any other disability that they might have. Some other just general tips that are kind of helpful. So do's and don'ts. So do things and don't do things. So don't demand information from everyone with a disability. You don't walk around Walmart telling everyone your prescription for your glasses, and people with disabilities aren't required to disclose a whole bunch of information to you. Don't assume that someone needs your help. So if someone with a disability that you can see is in a place where you are, don't assume that they're going to automatically need you to come rescue them. They might be just fine on their own. It's okay to offer your help, and if the person does accept your help, then listen to them. If they're able to communicate with you what they need, then do that. People with disabilities live with their own needs and challenges every day, and so they probably know a lot more about how to handle those than a random stranger does. As far as our students, we definitely are going to need more information on our students because we do have some relationship with them and because we have to be their teacher and we have to provide for their needs. So I'm going to kind of talk about how these relate to teachers as well. So when you're talking to a student with a disability about what they need in your class, a good idea might be to try to say, hey, what do you need, or how can I help you? When you're talking to the student's parents, what does the student need? How can I help the student? Talking to their special education provider. Any of those people would be great to communicate with and talk about, hey, like, how can I help this student? But we also don't need to reveal a whole bunch of details about a person's disability to others. So in an IEP meeting, obviously we have to be discussing a student's strengths and weaknesses and areas for improvement, but we don't need to discuss this in the teacher's lounge or at lunch to our colleagues who don't even have the student in their class. That also becomes a really big liability issue, and you can actually get sued for it. So revealing personal information about a student is not cool, and we don't need to do that. For what we do want to do, we do want to speak and interact with people with disabilities directly whenever possible. So what this means is if you're talking to a student with a disability, and their parent, if the student is able to communicate with you, then talk to the student. If you would talk to any of your other students instead of their parents, then talk to that student as well. I think that the time in my career that I have had the most trouble with this is not actually speaking to students with disabilities, it's actually speaking to parents who don't speak English. So when you're speaking through a translator, you're supposed to talk to the person that you're wanting to convey information to. So in this case, for me, it was the parent. So don't talk to the translator, talk straight to the parent. And even if the translator needs to help you, you are still having a conversation with the parent. So it kind of follows the same protocol. Instead of talking through somebody, some third party, maybe a parent, maybe a teacher, to a student with a disability, talk to the student directly. Do talk to close friends if you have them, or your students, like I said, about the needs and ways that you can help. So I kind of already covered that. And then do always try to be respectful. Obviously, I know that you all are amazing teachers and you want the best for your students. So really, we're just out here trying to be as respectful as we can of students. In conclusion, person first language means describing a person before their disability. The goal is just to be respectful and help bring a more positive view to people who are living with disabilities. Everyone makes mistakes. I make mistakes all the time, but the important thing is to keep trying to improve. So if you accidentally mess up, I know it's okay, but just try your best to start using this, and kind of once you get the hang of it, it's really not too difficult. If you have questions, I've included a link to a website where parents of children with disabilities and then people with disabilities themselves have written a whole bunch of articles, so you can kind of get a first-hand perspective of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about person first language. And I've also included my email, so if you would like to email me and ask me any questions, I will do my absolute best to try to answer. Thank you so much for learning with me today.